In 1868, a journalist closely watched Chinese Transcontinental Railroad workers eat dinner and was struck by what he saw. They ate better than any white crew anywhere along the line. Meanwhile, Irish and white workers drank water straight from the rivers beside the tracks and got sick because of it. Here are 13 real meals that fed the men who literally built America's railroad backbone. Before we go on, subscribe now. Item 7 on this list explains why one group of railroad workers almost never got sick while another group lived sick. And the answer has nothing to do with genetics. The Chinese railroad workers' diet. In 1868, journalist Charles Nordhoff closely observed what Chinese workers on the Central Pacific ate, and he was surprised by what he found. According to his account, still cited today by Stanford University's Chinese Railroad Workers in North America project, the diet included dried oysters, dried cuttlefish, dried fish, bamboo shoots, salted cabbage, 5 kinds of dried vegetables, dried mushrooms, tea, and rice. A far greater variety than the meat, beans, bread, and potatoes that made up the standard diet of white workers on the same railroad. Each group of 20 Chinese workers had its own cook, who negotiated directly with California suppliers to secure these ingredients, even when it cost more than the company's standard ration. White workers, according to Nordhoff himself, looked at this food with suspicion and disgust, without realizing they were looking at a far more balanced diet than their own. And that exact dietary difference explained a second mystery of the railroad camps: why one entire group of workers almost never got sick. Bacon and eggs, fried on a coal shovel. Inside the closed cab of a steam locomotive, the only fire available during an hours-long run was literally the firebox powering the entire train. Accounts from American and British engineers and firemen describe a recurring practice: cleaning a coal shovel, placing bacon and eggs on it, and pushing the shovel into the open firebox door for a few seconds until the food fried in the direct heat of the flames. The practice appears both in specialized American railroad publications and in British Railway Museum archives, though some older railwaymen debate whether it was daily routine or just an occasional novelty on longer runs. Either way, it was the only kitchen available to men locked inside a hot, noisy cab for an entire shift without stopping anywhere. And if the firebox became a stove for engineers, one specific stopping point would completely change how all of America thought about travel food: Harvey House meals. Before 1876, stopping to eat at a train station in the American West usually meant bad. Overpriced food served in a rush. Fred Harvey changed that by opening a chain of restaurants right at stations along the Atchison, Topeka, and Santa Fe Railway with trained waitresses, the famous Harvey girls, serving full meals within the train's exact stop time. The quality was so far above the era's standard that Harvey houses became a selling point for the railroad itself, drawing passengers who chose that specific line just for the food at its stops. Railroad workers themselves, when they had access, also benefited from this higher food standard at fixed points along the route, a huge contrast to the unstable, improvised food of most mobile construction camps. It was proof that when a railroad decided to invest in quality food, it could deliver that at scale, something no trail camp could ever replicate. Wok cooking at the Chinese Camp's High on Donner Summit in California, where Chinese crews spent 16 months digging tunnels through the mountain between 1865 and 1867, archaeologists led by Scott Baxter found clear evidence of how food was actually prepared. Keyhole-shaped stoves, built specifically to fit woks, were identified among the wooden cabins where groups of 12 to 20 workers lived and ate. Alongside the stoves, archaeologists found Chinese stoneware used to store pickled fruits and vegetables, along with fragments of jars specifically made for sauces or rice wine. The sheer amount of pig and chicken bone found at the site surprised researchers, who had expected a more limited diet. The abundance of meat there was far greater than most of these workers would have had access to in their home villages in China. That same disciplined, well-equipped cooking setup repeated at every Chinese camp along the line, decades before any concept of a standardized field kitchen existed in the United States. You've seen 4 of these 13 dishes so far, but Hold on to this. Item 7 explains why one entire group of workers almost never got sick, while the other lived sick constantly. And item 12 is even stranger. A camp food directly tied to the near extinction of an entire species. Whiskey rations for the track layers. While Chinese workers on the Central Pacific drank tea and boiled water, the white and Irish crews of the Union Pacific, working the eastern side of the Transcontinental Railroad, received an official ration of meat, beans, bread, butter, potatoes, and whiskey. Whiskey wasn't just a social drink. In many camps, it functioned almost as part of the productivity incentive, handed out to keep up the brutal pace of laying track through sun, snow, and tight deadlines as the two railroad companies raced to lay more track than their rival. The contrast with the dietary discipline on the Chinese side of the project couldn't have been sharper, and decades later, historians would directly compare the two diets as one of the factors behind real health differences between the crews. Drinking was tolerated, sometimes even encouraged, at a time when workplace safety was not a priority for either railroad company. Hold on to that drink contrast. Tea on one side, whiskey on the other, because it explains a health mystery that only makes sense 2 items from now. The boomers tiered lunch pail. Itinerant railroad workers, known as boomers for jumping from job to job following new rail construction across the country, carried their food in a metal lunch pail with stacked compartments, one tier for meat or eggs, another for bread, another reserved specifically for a slice of pie. This tiered lunch pail design became so tied to railroad worker identity that it practically became a visual symbol of the profession, appearing in period photographs alongside hard hats and track tools. Unlike settled farm or factory workers, a boomer had no home or fixed kitchen for long stretches of time. The stacked pail was, in practice, his entire kitchen reduced to an object that fit in one hand. Carrying a slice of pie, however small, was a deliberate luxury within a lifestyle defined by constant movement and few possessions.
Before we continue, take a guess. Why do you think one entire group of workers on the same railroad almost never got sick, while the other lived sick? It's not genetics. The answer is ridiculously simple, and it's coming right now.
Boiled tea. The real reason behind the health gap. The real explanation behind the much better health of Central Pacific's Chinese crews wasn't genetics or luck. It was a simple drink preparation habit. While white and Irish workers drank water straight from the rivers and streams along the line, Chinese workers had the custom of boiling water to make tea, a cultural habit that, without anyone at the time understanding the exact scientific reason, eliminated much of the bacteria responsible for dysentery and other waterborne illnesses. Historians studying the Transcontinental Railroad project today point to that difference in habit, more than any biological difference between the groups, as the central explanation for why Chinese camps reported far fewer disease outbreaks than neighboring camps. It was science happening by cultural accident, decades before any railroad company took the quality of the water it supplied to its own workers seriously. It's the same drink difference you held on to back at the whiskey item, now with the full explanation behind it. Bread baked in an oil drum. In mobile construction camps with no bakery or fixed oven available, track crews improvised ovens out of empty oil drums, lined and adapted to bake bread right at the worksite. Bread baked this way rarely had real bakery texture or flavor, but it served the essential function of providing a hot carbohydrate source for workers in the middle of nowhere, far from any town or fixed supplier. This kind of improvisation was typical of the railroad's most isolated construction phase, when the entire camp moved every few miles as the track advanced, and no permanent structure made sense to build. As soon as a town or fixed rail depot was established along the line, this kind of improvised oven quickly disappeared, replaced by real bakeries. But while the line was still advancing, the oil drum was the only oven available. Turtle soup from the southern swamps. In the swamps of the American South, where rail lines pushed through flooded terrain in Louisiana and Mississippi, Construction crews found a protein source in the surrounding waters that required no outside supply at all: freshwater turtles. Hunted and cooked into a thick soup with whatever vegetables and seasoning were on hand, turtles solved a real logistics problem, supplying fresh meat to temporary camps set up far from any town, on terrain where raising cattle or hunting larger game was practically impossible. The practice followed a food tradition already established among southern riverside communities long before the railroad arrived, quickly adopted by the construction crews temporarily settling in those areas. It was, once again, proof that railroad camp food depended entirely on whatever geography the line happened to be crossing at that moment. That's 9 of 13 dishes revealed so far, but item 12 directly connects camp food to one of the biggest ecological tragedies in American history. Keep going until then. River catfish fried in cornmeal. When the rail line ran parallel to a river, as it often did across much of the American South and Midwest, fish became the most accessible and cheapest protein available to construction crews. Catfish, abundant in American rivers, were caught directly by the crews themselves during work breaks, coated in a simple layer of cornmeal, and fried in leftover fat from other meals. This preparation method, common throughout American riverside cooking, required almost no ingredient that had to be shipped in by the supply train itself, just cornmeal, fat, and the fish the river provided for free. For camps that moved constantly and couldn't rely on regular supply runs, this partial independence from outside supply represented a real survival advantage. Companies store canned beef on credit. Many railroad camps operated under a system where workers bought food from the company store using credit scrip deducted directly from their wages, a system that, in practice, financially tied the worker to his own employer. Canned beef was one of the best-selling items in these stores, precisely because it lasted for months without refrigeration and didn't depend on local slaughter or hunting, unlike much of the rest of the camp menu. The problem was that prices at these company stores were usually higher than at any normal market, and the worker rarely had a real alternative since the camp sat far from any other commerce. This company store system would repeat decades later in coal mines and other geographically isolated industries. But in the railroad camps of the late 19th century, it was already fully established as part of the business model of building the line. Dried buffalo meat sold to rail crews. Before the railroad itself accelerated the hunting and near extermination of the American buffalo across the plains, independent hunters sold dried buffalo meat directly to construction crews, passing through territory still full of herds. The meat, sun-dried and cut into long strips, kept for weeks without refrigeration, and offered a cheaper protein source than any canned meat shipped in by the supply train. This direct trade between hunters and railroad camps helped create a steady demand that, combined with sport hunting and hide hunting, contributed to the near-total collapse of buffalo herds in less than 2 decades. It's one of the rare moments on this list where railroad camp food was directly tied to one of the largest ecological transformations in American history, not just a matter of logistics or household economy. Ice-cooled melon at rail depots. The same railroad technology that could haul rails, ties, and heavy equipment also made it possible for the first time in many regions to transport large quantities of ice to isolated stops along the line. Vendors at stations and rail depots began offering chilled fruit, especially watermelon, kept on blocks of ice that arrived by train from colder regions or urban ice factories. For workers used to months of dry, canned, or boiled food, a genuinely cold slice of fruit was a luxury that simply hadn't existed before the railroad made that kind of transport possible. It's the perfect closing note for this list. The same line that demanded brutal dietary sacrifice from thousands of workers was, at the same time, the technology that brought one of the first true modern food luxuries into the middle of the American interior. These 13 meals show that the food of the men who built the American railroad was never just one thing. It depended on who you were, where you came from, and which part of the country the line was crossing at that moment. Boiled tea saved lives on one side of the project while whiskey kept up the pace on the other, and the same technology that forced that sacrifice also became, decades later, what brought ice and fresh fruit into the middle of the American interior. Did you imagine the health gap between two crews on the same railroad came down to a habit as simple as boiling water for tea? Subscribe now, because the next video reveals another group of workers' history left out. Comment below. Which of these 13 dishes surprised you more? The survival one or the luxury one?